Welcome. This is F Rap Critic. It's your boy Malik 16 from Place and Create to Know. I didn't forget the wall logo and move to a different side of the room. I am actually on location in the great state of Texas, and it only makes sense that I time the review of this album with being on the road here, because we're talking about none other than the 1989 classic Grip It on that other level by Houston's own the Geto Boys. Now, this is technically the second album by the Geto Boys, but this is the first album featuring this lineup and iteration of the Geto Boys, which is the first time we're hearing Willie D and Scarface on track, and the album that gave us the version of the group that we have all come to know and understand. This is also credited as being the first album that introduced the subgenre of horrorcore hip-hop to the game, for better or for worse, and we'll get a little bit into that further down. But before we go and move on, please like and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. You know what to do. We are still building this global hip-hop community, and it's dependent upon you leaving comments, leaving your scores, and sharing them so we can build up and get these averages and calculations. Until then, I'm going to move forward. Of course, this is video one, which means we're going over category one, which is the product, the album itself. And when we're talking about that, of course, the first dimension we have to get into is dimension one, the quality of the production. How dope were the beats on Grip It on that other level? So it's 1989. Most of the production on this album was handled by group member and DJ Ready Red. And what's ironic is that this album was supposed to like put the stamp on the South being taken seriously in hip hop and being recognized, which it did in a lot of ways. Geto Boys are like the NWA of the South, especially because this was the turn of things turning into this was the turn of the more gangsterized style of rap and the beginning of the popularity. So the timing was there, but the irony exists because most of the production borrows from or just continues everything that was already going on in hip hop, which was mostly dominated by East Coast. And we say East Coast, everybody means New York, and not introducing a new sound or anything. That came more from the vocals. Production wise, you're getting all the standard fare that you get from producers of the day. You're getting samples from Apache, lots of James Brown samples, sampling very obvious loops like Superfly by Curtis Mayfield. So like on Bushwick Bill's solo, Size Ain't Ish, you can tell Ready Red was in an experimental bag, because you're hearing pieces of the Mount Airy groove over these other like disco type samples, but splice, like somebody was really plugging in these sounds that don't necessarily go together, but because it's supposed to be this frenetic kind of frenzy song that's bouncing all around and matching Bushwick Bill's energy, you get something that's out of the box. It's definitely a standout track. And then there's the song Gangster of Love, which samples Joker by Steve Miller Band, which, at first is straightforward for the first like 4 to 8 bars, but then where it gets creative is it loops after that for about 4 bars, and it does this inverse of the bass line where it gets spliced and doubled up and just kind of volleys. And I thought that was creative because they could have just kept it a standard loop. And that was ironically produced by the former group member, Prince C, which apparently Jay Prince had kicked out of the group as this album was being created, because the first album had bombed so much. But his production still counted as a contribution to the album. And then you have other producers like Doug King and a producer named Beto, who really is responsible for a lot of the East Coast sounding songs on here. More experimentation you get on tracks like Life in the Fast Lane, where Ready Red really does play around with samples. There's even harmonica sounds in there, and I guess that's to play up the whole country. And that's probably the closest you get to trying to, distinguish this being a Southern rap album from what else was going on in rap. And so I thought the use of a harmonica, and we're not talking about a subtle harmonica, we're talking about a bluesy, down-home harmonica being the main melody for the verses, and then going to this Parliament Funkadelic kind of East Coast sample for the hook. Really, really interesting. So Ready Red is in his bag when he's experimenting and does his best work there. Not to say that the direct samples, like sampling Curtis Mayfield and the JBs with James Brown, it never gets old. So some of that creates this timelessness. So from the first track, like Do It Like a Geo, to the last track, Mind of a Lunatic, it's kind of the cheat code, like what we talked about when we reviewed Puffy's album. When you're taking a song that's so famous and timeless on its own and you're just adding break beats to it, it lives the same way. So something for you all to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That's the quality of the production, which takes us to dimension 2, which is the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. So you got these different producers, mostly Ready Red. You got lots of East Coast influence in there, some experimentation. But for the most part, like I said, it doesn't deviate from what was going on in hip hop at that time. So nothing really clashes. So and what I thought was really well done, maybe this is credited to Jay Prince as the executive producer or just to the whole team, is that, you know, when you get your funk samples, it's followed by something that's just a little bit more boom bap afterwards. And so there are some original beats here. I think, you know, Willie D's solo Read My Nikes I think that's just a straight original, but it's so basic. But it came at decent timing because it came after you've heard like 3 famous samples right beforehand. You know, Talking Loud, Saying Nothing, they just rip the James Brown song and give it a hip hop twist. And then you get those songs. I mentioned the Bushwick Bill solo, which is experimental. And then just when it's time to get, you know, to another familiar song, they at least space them out in a way where you don't feel like, man, this whole album is just nothing but a bunch of gang samples. Nope. Yeah, it's spread out pretty evenly. Bass lines are consistent all throughout. I think the DJ cuts and scratches really hold the album together to it and remind you that you are still getting a very pure hip hop album, even if what's being done vocally and on the mic deviates from what was going on. Like sonically, it is undeniably hip hop, and it's regionless. And maybe that's the beauty of it. I don't know if that's what they were trying to execute, but the beauty of it is that if you're on the West Coast, the East Coast, or the South, it just sounded like hip hop. It didn't sound like something that you have to adjust to. All right, so something for you all to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That is the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. Now we move on to dimension 3, where the question is there an intentional mood or tone on this album? Good old horrorcore, right? So if we had to narrow down a couple themes and a couple, you know, things that are reiterated and emphasized throughout the album, mostly by the talking part. So Jay Prince makes his presence felt on the beginning and the end of the album and really driving the point home, which you can tell is his agenda, not necessarily the agenda of the group, but the group is his brainchild. So he gets to do that, which is this idea that you've heard, you know, people who follow like Master P and Suge Knight do. Hey, we're black owned. We do things our way. This is why we started ourselves up like this, because we didn't want to play by the rules and have to negotiate and you know, get ripped off. We're doing this, but as a result, we are blackballed. And so you'll hear that blackballing theme throughout in different ways. You know, Geto Boys directly address feeling like East Coast, which again really means New York, because you rarely ever hear somebody, you know, talking about East Coast as a coast. No one starts talking about Boston and Baltimore and Philadelphia. They're just like East Coast, meaning New York, right? Because that was whoever played radio. And then they talked about, you know, parents and the whole controversy that was this wave rising against the wave of gangster rap. And so being blackballed and not caring, but caring, that seems to be a theme. And more than anything to that, if you had to sum this album up into a one word, it's shock. Shock. That is a theme. Every song is pretty much tailored to shock you, except for maybe Seek and Destroy. And every verse and almost every other word is intended to shock you. And this was intentional, and this is very much in the vein of 2 Live Crew and NWA, because this was the time for it. We'll talk a little bit more about that in subsequent dimensions. That's dimension 3. The question of whether there was an intentional mood or tone, something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Now we move to dimension 4. The song distinction versus the repetitionness, the overall repetitiveness of the words and sounds. We already talked a little bit about that in the Sonic Bed review. Interestingly enough, you don't get there's not a lot of room for redundancy here, because everything is fast-paced. The BPM stayed kind of on the higher end here for a Southern rap album, but because of the time, that was the vibe of hip hop. Hip hop was about moving and cutting and being able to jam out the trunk. And so the legendary slowness of Texas hadn't hit yet. So for the BPMs to be pretty high on this album meant drums, kicking, bass lines keeping up with the drums, and instruments being sped up to do that. The slowest song on here is probably the 2 songs about women, which are, Let a Hoe Be a Hoe and Gangsta Love. And then even that gets cut up and sped up in these parts where it reminds you that it's a hip hop track, just so it doesn't slow the album down. So no, the samples are diverse enough where you're not getting the same kind of melodies or the same kind of musical instruments being utilized. The drums may be similar, but you wind up not paying as much attention to that because the bass lines vary. The words are so the emphasis of these songs that, there's not a lot of time to think about if these are the same drums on the other ones, because they're mostly break beats. We know most break beats sound the same anyway, right? So then words, yes, there's lots of redundancy because there is a lot of talking about things in the same way and talking about the same kinds of things. So a lot of the curse words get used repeatedly. All of the curse words are being used at a frequency that was mastered by NWA. Again, the same thing. This is a calculated move. Even your worst police station full of dirty mouth cops, or your best friend who curses like a sailor, does not curse as much as these rappers did in the beginning of gangster rap, because they were taking advantage of something that no one knew you could do in rap, and it was like a kid in a candy store. So every 2 words is a curse word, an explicit curse word. We talk about the 7 words George Carlin was saying you can't use on TV because they could. Not because, this is just how people talk every day. It was excessive. So you're getting a lot of the same curse words used. But rap-wise, what that does, for rappers like Willie D and Bushwick Bill, they almost seem to exhaust themselves with how much they curse and start saying the same things over in different ways, but using the same words, because the themes repeat. It's only so many ways to say I'll kick your ass, put my foot up your ass, or I'll beat you down and stomp you out. It's just, there's that repeatedly. Or how many different ways you can have sex with a woman and not in a loving way, right? So that's pretty much that's where the redundancy factor comes in. Scarface seems to be a little bit more adept at using different unique words in between all of the shock and curses, but you do get plenty of redundancy on this album when it comes to that. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 5. Great time to bring this up. The amount of content versus the amount of songs. This album has 12 songs, and we always are talking on this channel about the safe numbers for classic albums. of any genre, but in particular hip hop, 10 to 14 is where you want to live, to be in that safe zone. And this album sits right in the middle of that. So out of 12 songs, and I'm sure, you know, if you read interviews or you hear any of the surviving members of the Geto Boys talk about whether or not they felt like they were saying something, I'm sure they do, because you get tracks like Do It Like a Geo, where they're slipping in, you know, knowledge. And this is where Scarface parallels Ice Cube to me, because this is, you know, a kid. When they brought him into the group, still a teenager, you know, actively, you know, going to school. I don't know if he dropped out by then, but, you know, these were high school kids. And you can imagine the average male high school imagination and rebelliousness going on in their minds at that time. You're offering to pay them to be shocking. That's like, again, a kid in a candy store. And so what Scarface does, and what we've come to know him as and evolve into, is the urban griot, the thought-provoking godfather of hip-hop, who is going to reflect and lament on things. This is not who we're getting in 1989. Same thing with Ice Cube. You're getting the, you know, straight out of Compton, the crazy, you know, on his first solo album. Then you're starting to see these nuances of, you know, him dropping science and being hip to the game and making these socially conscious observations. Same thing with Scarface. As soon as he emerges as a solo artist, you're getting those sides. You start to get pieces and bits of that here, just like you did on NWA stuff, where Ice Cube could write a song like Express Yourself, same way as he could write a song like Dope Man, right? So you get pieces where Scarface slips in bits about Black history, slavery, the prison, the school to prison pipeline, and you're getting that on songs like Do It Like a Geo and Ain't No Sellout. And even Willie D, you know, Willie D, you can tell the songs that he led, that he wanted to get across. And I think Do It Like a Geo is one of them, and I think Ain't No Sellout is one of them, because he had very strong feelings about not getting respected by the East Coast, New York, but still showing love to New York rappers. So it wasn't New York itself, it was New York radio. And anybody who was trying to infringe on their freedom of speech, very much like I said, Luke in the 2 Live Crew situation. That, if nothing else, was Willie D's main driving point on this album. You know, if you look at that, that's 2 songs, and then out of 12, you're left with 10. 2 songs directly address relations with women in kind of the same way, one worse than the other, but you know, you're getting a varied amount of subject matter. Bushwick Bill solos, very different than Scarface's solos. And so in there, you're getting something. Life in the Fast Lane tries to describe what the title says, but then it also turns into this kind of like glorification tale. So something you want to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about the amount of content versus the overall amount of songs on this album. Not a lot of wasted space here, despite the redundancy, which takes us to Dimension 6, features. One thing I love about these releases in the late 80s or any point in the 80s is that it just wasn't the era for expecting lots of outside guests on an album. It was mostly trying to, you know, highlight the rapper's skill and their talent. So no features here. I don't know if you think that is a drawback or a strength on this album, but something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to Dimension 7, which is the question of, does the weakest song on the album take away from it? I always leave it up to you as the voter and the scorer, the ranker, to determine what you think the weakest song on here is. There are several solos. Willie D gets 2 on here. Read My Nikes, Let Her Hope You Ho. Bushwick Bill gets 1, the size joint. And you can tell Mind of a Lunatic, he takes the lead on, but everybody's featured on that one. And Scarface gets about 3, which is Seek and Destroy, Life in the Fast Lane, and Scarface. And yeah, other than that, the rest of the songs are group performances. and I have no idea what to consider the weakest song here. You know, Read My Nikes has been legendary, and I might have to go with Bushwick Bill being the weakest, but that's even that is a stretch, because weak here is relative. It's so relative because they're all kind of talking about the same thing on this album. And so Bushwick's solo, he does about maybe 4.5 verses, long verses too. He's just all over the place on that track, and because he loses pace at some point, that's the only reason I would say that may be in the weaker vein. But none of the songs here take away from each other. If you don't like one, then you probably don't like another, and if you like one, then you probably like them all. If you're not taken aback by the second song on this album and you decide to keep listening, I can't see you being more shocked as you go, or more appalled or more turned off. You know, maybe the sample you may not like, but something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5. Heartbeats does the weakest song take away from the album. Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. I to this, even now, I can't put my finger on what Jay Prince's vision was. I know he had just replaced members, got new blood for the group, but it seemed like they were hell-bent on pushing the envelope and being provocative, and not even just past provocative, and then also being unapologetic about it, but almost complaining about it. And so it is weird. It's you know, they used enough of the standard, you know, grooves and practices that were going on in hip hop for this to mesh well with anything else, right? You can play a Public Enemy song and play this right after, and sonically it's not gonna cause any disruption. It's the content though. And you know, there's tracks where they're like, radio won't play me, and I'm thinking, man, where could this be played? Even now, I wonder. You know, it makes me think of the first verse of Explosive off the Dr. Dre 2001 Chronic album, with Corrupt's verse going first, and when they played it on radio, they had to not only bleep out so many parts of the verse, they just had to shorten it. And then some radio stations just skipped to Nate Dogg's part. That's what this album would have played like in 1989, where full hip-hop stations barely existed. You had to wait till like the mix show segments. And I mean, I don't know if there's an edited version of this album. So Mass Appeal gets limited by the content alone. And so if Jay Prince and company say that their goal was to aim and flood the streets, well, mission accomplished. You know, this is a highly successful album as time is going on. The shock led to word of mouth, led to infamy and popularity. So really something to consider when you're ranking this on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, because the subject matter creates this current on one level and it stifles it on another level. On the mainstream level, it stunted it, you know, it cut its legs off before it even started. But on the underground level, it became a monster. Which takes us to Dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. Now, we're talking about impact. I said earlier, this is the album that birthed horrorcore hip hop. So beyond, even though this was at the same time as NWA, beyond what NWA was doing, these guys are going into really, really dark themes. We're talking about rape. We're talking about murder. We're talking about domestic violence. We're talking about assault and battery with intent, and just, you know, on top of the standard street life, drug dealing kind of things, and bravado. This is taking it to another that other level, right? And you know it's intentional, but I don't know if that opened doors to something that was, you know, for the greater or for the worse. There was definitely an impact that was made on the Southern hip hop landscape Willie D's declaration was definitely heard. You know, it was known that a line was being drawn in the sand. I think this, you know, fermented some tensions that Southerners and Northerners have in general, and it gave a voice to it. So now, you know, we're forever kind of gonna have that schism. Even if there's peace, there's always this, well, this is how we do it here, this is how we do it here. That's not going anywhere. And I think this sparked a wave of other independent, out the trunk Southern and West Coast pioneers to do it. You know, you got Suave House, you got No Limit, you got all of these labels that were like, look, we're not gonna get played here, we're gonna do it ourselves. You get Hypnotized Minds and everything. So I do think that's not only the impact, because this became a talked about word of mouth album. Like, man, you heard what they said on the record? Or, hey, fine. You know, a lot of people feel like finally someone talking like we talk, or someone keeping it gutter. You know, some people really tout freedom of speech, but what is the point of freedom of speech when the question is, what are you using it for? Was this worth fighting for? Just the right to say any damn thing on the mic, even if we're talking about the worst things in human existence, for the sake of what? And you know, we'll talk more about this in category 2, but the influence happens. Hardcore becomes a thing. It doesn't last long. It still exists in pockets, you know, depending on how deep down a rabbit hole you want to get. In the 90s, it was acts like Gravediggers. You get Insane Clown Posse and Cage and some real underground niche Necro. But I mean, it depends. It's a very, very niche market, as you could imagine. It's almost like death metal. Death metal is not a top dominant genre of music. It's you got to be really in a space to favor that kind of music. And you know, innovation, like I told you on the production, I don't think the wheel was being reinvented production wise. Lyrically, no, maybe the advent of being able to curse a lot, but NWA was doing the same thing. So not a lot of innovation, except, you know, this Southern presence. The Southern presence itself was the innovation on this album. And, you know, all these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're talking about the influence, the impact, and the innovation on this album, which takes us to the final dimension, the overall timelessness and uniqueness of this album. A lot of people will feel like this is timeless because it introduced Scarface and Willie D, who are now staples of hip hop. A lot of people's favorite rappers, or Scarface being on a lot of people's top 10 and top 5 lists and being considered, you know, a GOAT for his poetic sensibilities. This is, again, not the Scarface you get on this album. This is the beginning. It's very hard to imagine someone considering this album timeless without attaching a nostalgia to it. I don't think this is an album that aged well. Definitely by today's PC standards, this album wouldn't have even made it off of the shelves in any kind of wide release. And you know, the beats do sound like a product of their time, except for the beats with the strong, obvious samples. Like I said, they get that timeless quality, but for the most part, your original beats, your Read These Nikes and, you know, Size and those songs, Seek and Destroy, it's like they could have stayed where they were and been frozen in time. So yeah, I really wonder if timelessness is a word you would attach to this album. And then as far as uniqueness, a Texas voice, a Southern rap voice, being one of the first to touch it, make them automatic pioneers. I do think that's where this album shines the most. It's like, oh, I had no idea Texas was so similar to my hood. This feels like any hood USA. It doesn't feel like a Houston Fifth Ward album. They're not mentioning these, you know, you gotta be there to know them kind of things. It's just, this applies anywhere, especially because you have a member like Bushwick Bill, who's from Brooklyn. So he's adding an East Coast sensibility to a group that's trying to put the flag in the ground for the South. And I mean, the South. It gets no more South than Texas. And so something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you are considering the overall timelessness and uniqueness of this album. Join me for video 2, where we go over category 2, which is the rap performance on this album, and that's gonna be a doozy. Till then, you know what it is. F a rap critic. Talk about it while I live it.